Above 8,000 meters, sound behaves differently. It does not echo, it disappears. Mount Everest rises along the border of Nepal and Tibet, its summit reaching 8,848 meters above sea level. The mountain stands within the Mahalangur Himal sub-range of the Himalayas. To the south lies the Khumbu region of Nepal, a terrain of glacial valleys, shifting icefalls, and wind-scoured ridgelines. The air pressure at the summit is roughly a third of that at sea level. Oxygen is limited. Movement is slow. In spring, before the monsoon arrives, narrow windows of relative stability draw climbers upward. Expeditions establish a series of camps along the South Col route. From base camp, at 5,364 meters, climbers pass through the Khumbu icefall, ascend the western Khwim, climb the Lhotse face, and reach Camp 4 at approximately 7,900 meters. Above that point lies what mountaineers call the death zone, where prolonged survival is not possible. The terrain appears static from a distance. Snowfields and rock bands seem fixed in place, yet the mountain is in constant motion. Seracs fracture without warning. Jet stream winds sweep across the summit ridge at over 100 kilometers per hour. Temperatures can fall below minus 40 degrees Celsius. In May 1996, during one such pre-monsoon window, several commercial expeditions prepared for summit attempts. Among them was a Japanese climber nearing the completion of a lifelong goal. Her name was Yasuko Namba. Yasuko Namba was born in 1,949 inches, Japan. She worked for Federal Express Japan as a human resources director. Outside her professional life, she pursued high-altitude mountaineering with steady focus. Climbing was not an impulse for her. It was a structured objective developed over years. By the early 1990s, Namba had already completed 6 of the 7 summits, the highest peaks on each continent. She had climbed Mount Kilimanjaro in Africa, Mount McKinley in North America, Aconcagua in South America, Mount Elbrus in Europe, Vinson Massif in Antarctica, and Carstensz Pyramid in Oceania. Everest remained the final peak required to complete the list. In 1996, commercial guided expeditions on Everest had become more common. Companies organized logistics, high-altitude Sherpa support, oxygen supplies, and fixed ropes. Clients paid substantial fees to join these teams. One such organization was Adventure Consultants, led by New Zealand guide Rob Hall. Another was Mountain Madness, led by American guide Scott Fisher. Both teams would attempt the summit in May of that year. Namba joined the Adventure Consultants expedition. The team assembled in Kathmandu in March 1996 before trekking to base camp. Climbers underwent acclimatization rotations, moving gradually between camps to adjust to decreasing oxygen levels. This process took weeks. Fixed ropes were installed along key sections of the route, including the Lhotse face and portions of the upper mountain. Reports from teammates described Namba as determined and methodical. She was physically small in stature, which some believed made high-altitude endurance more demanding. However, she had successfully climbed 6 continental high points. Her presence on Everest was the final step in a long progression, rather than a spontaneous ambition. Commercial expeditions in the mid-1990s followed a structured summit plan. Climbers typically left Camp 4 near midnight, aiming to reach the summit in the early afternoon before descending the same day. A strict turnaround time, often around 2 p.m., was intended to prevent climbers from being caught high on the mountain after dark. Weather forecasts for early May 1996 suggested a narrow window around May 10. Multiple teams coordinated summit attempts for that date. Crowding on key sections of the route was anticipated but not fully managed. Fixed lines were in place, yet delays were possible if ropes required resetting or if climbers queued along steep bottlenecks. By May 9, climbers from Adventure Consultants and Mountain Madness moved from Camp 3 to Camp 4 at the South Col. The South Col is a broad, windswept saddle between Everest and Lhotse. At nearly 8,000 meters, it offers minimal shelter. Tents are secured with anchors buried in snow and ice. Oxygen cylinders are cached in preparation for the summit push. On the evening of May 9, climbers rested briefly. Supplemental oxygen systems were checked. Headlamps were prepared. Boots were kept inside sleeping bags to prevent freezing. Most climbers would begin their ascent shortly before midnight. For Yasuko Namba, this ascent represented the final stage of a goal pursued over years. The route above the South Col was exposed but familiar in outline. The balcony, the South Summit, the Hillary Step, and finally the true summit ridge. The mountain appeared calm that night. Shortly before midnight on the 9th of May 1996, climbers began leaving Camp 4 at the South Kernel. Headlamps formed a slow-moving line against the darkness. The temperature was well below freezing. Winds were light. Conditions appeared within the expected range for a summit attempt. The ascent from the South Col to the balcony at 8,400 meters is steep and sustained. Climbers move in fixed intervals, clipped to ropes. Supplemental oxygen flows through masks at regulated rates. Progress depends on steady pacing. Above the balcony, the route follows a narrow ridge toward the south summit. Delays began early. Fixed ropes that had been planned for installation along sections of the route were not fully in place when climbers arrived. Sherpas moved ahead to secure lines while clients waited. The waiting occurred at extreme altitude. Standing still in thin air increases fatigue and oxygen consumption. As the morning advanced, summit teams stretched across the upper ridge. Some climbers reached the summit before early afternoon. Others arrived later than intended. The established turnaround time of 2 p.m. passed for several individuals who continued upward. Yasuko Namba reached the summit in the early afternoon, reportedly around 2 p.m., though exact times vary in accounts. By then, weather conditions were beginning to change. Clouds were building. Winds increased. Visibility began to deteriorate. Descending from the summit is physically more demanding than ascending. Muscles are fatigued. Oxygen supplies are diminished. Navigation becomes more complex when visibility drops. On May 10, a storm system intensified in the afternoon. Snow and high winds swept across the south summit and the southeast ridge. By late afternoon, whiteout conditions developed. Landmarks became difficult to distinguish. Climbers descending toward the south Col struggled to locate fixed lines and route markers. Some became separated from guides. Others slowed significantly due to exhaustion. Isolation at high altitude does not occur gradually. It occurs when movement stops. By evening, several climbers remained above the South Col in deteriorating weather. The descent had become uncertain. The margin for recovery was narrowing. By late afternoon on May 10, descending climbers were spread across the upper southeast ridge. Snow was blowing laterally across the slope. Wind speeds increased as the storm strengthened. Visibility narrowed to only a few meters at times. The established route between the South Summit and the South Col became difficult to follow. Yasuko Namba descended with members of the Adventure Consultants team. Supplemental oxygen cylinders, staged earlier along the route, were critical for maintaining movement. At extreme altitude, decision-making slows. Physical coordination deteriorates. Even minor obstacles require focused effort. As daylight faded, several climbers, including Namba, were still above the South Kernel. Guides attempted to gather clients and direct them toward Camp 4. Communication was limited to shouted instructions and brief physical contact. Radio transmissions between climbers and the South Col were intermittent due to wind and battery limitations. During the descent, some climbers ran low on oxygen. Cylinders that had been cached earlier were not always located immediately in the storm. Reduced oxygen flow increases fatigue and impairs judgment. Progress slowed further. By early evening, a small group, including Namba, was near the South Col but not yet inside the tents of Camp 4. The South Col itself is an exposed plateau of wind-hardened snow and rock. In clear weather, tents are visible from short distance. In whiteout conditions, orientation can fail within meters. Several climbers became disoriented and stopped moving. At 8,000 meters, stopping is dangerous. The human body cannot sustain prolonged exposure without shelter or oxygen. Hypothermia progresses rapidly in high winds. Frostbite risk increases with immobility. Accounts from surviving climbers describe attempts to assist those who had fallen behind. Some were physically guided toward the South Kernel. Others were unable to stand without support. Movement required lifting and bracing individuals whose strength had diminished significantly. As darkness settled, wind-driven snow covered tracks within minutes. A group of climbers, including Namba, remained outside the tents. Some collapsed onto the snow. Efforts were made to move them into shelter, but the force of the storm limited visibility and balance. Those attempting rescue were themselves near exhaustion. Inside Camp 4, other climbers secured tent lines and monitored oxygen supplies. The tents shook under sustained gusts. Snow accumulated along their sides. Radio contact with higher elevations reported multiple climbers still unaccounted for. During the night, several rescue attempts were initiated from within Camp 4. Guides and Sherpas ventured out into the storm, clipped to fixed lines when possible, searching for stranded climbers. Wind speeds were reported to exceed 70 kilometers per hour. Exposure at that altitude, even for short durations, risked incapacitating rescuers. Namba was located near the South Col, partially sheltered by terrain but exposed to wind. She was conscious earlier in the evening but unable to move independently. Severe exhaustion and cold limited her responsiveness. At high altitude, hypoxia and hypothermia compound each other. As body temperature drops, shivering begins, followed by reduced mental clarity. Eventually, muscle coordination fails. Rescuers attempted to provide oxygen and encourage movement. In several accounts, climbers were lifted and guided toward tents. However, moving a fully exhausted climber at 8,000 meters is physically demanding even for a strong guide. Each step requires balance and oxygen. Repeated lifting depletes strength rapidly. During one rescue effort, multiple climbers were brought closer to Camp 4. Some were left temporarily, while rescuers returned for others. The storm persisted. Snow drifted across bodies lying on the slope. Equipment became buried. Headlamps were difficult to distinguish through blowing snow. Overnight, oxygen supplies diminished. Regulators can freeze in extreme cold. Masks accumulate ice from exhaled moisture. Removing gloves to adjust equipment exposes fingers to frostbite within minutes. By early morning on May 11, winds had decreased slightly, though temperatures remained severe. With daylight, climbers from Camp 4 ventured out again to assess those stranded nearby. Several individuals showed no response to verbal prompts or physical stimulation. Yasuko Namba was found in a semi-reclined position near the south kernel. According to survivor accounts, she was still alive in the early morning hours, but in critical condition. Severe hypothermia and altitude-related complications had progressed through the night. She was unable to stand or communicate clearly. Further rescue attempts were considered. However, rescuers themselves were operating at the limit of physical capacity. The storm had already claimed multiple lives on the mountain. Guides faced decisions shaped by altitude, weather, and available strength. Moving an unresponsive or barely responsive climber from 8,000 meters to a lower camp requires coordinated manpower and stable conditions, neither of which were present in sufficient measure. Efforts were made to administer oxygen. Attempts to reposition and protect her from wind were documented, but the duration of exposure had been extensive. High-altitude hypothermia, combined with cerebral and pulmonary stress common above 8,000 meters, reduces the likelihood of recovery once advanced stages are reached. The South Col that morning was scattered with damaged tents, partially buried equipment, and exhausted climbers. Some survivors prepared for descent as soon as weather permitted. Remaining at that altitude prolonged risk for everyone present. Throughout May 11, climbers assessed who could descend independently and who required assistance. Some began moving toward Camp 3 as conditions stabilized. Others remained at the South Col to recover minimal strength before attempting descent. Namba's condition did not improve. By later in the morning of May 11, she was no longer responsive. Rescuers confirmed the absence of vital signs. Due to extreme altitude and ongoing danger, her body could not be transported down the mountain at that time. The storm that began the previous afternoon had lasted through the critical descent window. In its aftermath, 8 climbers from multiple expeditions would be confirmed dead. On Everest, survival often depends on narrow margins. On May 10 and 11, 1,996, those margins closed gradually through wind, delay, and exhaustion. Morning light on the 11th of May, 1996, revealed the scale of the disaster. The storm had passed, but the South Col remained a field of wind-scoured snow and scattered equipment. Tents were partially collapsed. Oxygen cylinders lay half-buried. Climbers moved slowly. conserving energy for descent. Several individuals who had survived the night were suffering from frostbite, dehydration, and cognitive impairment caused by prolonged hypoxia. Guides conducted brief assessments, determining who could descend independently and who required assistance. At 8,000 meters, extended triage is not possible. Each decision must account for the physical limits of those providing help. Yasuko Namba was confirmed deceased during the morning of May 11. Her body remained near the south kernel. The altitude made recovery impossible under the circumstances. In 1996, helicopter rescue above base camp was not feasible, and even today, recovery from that elevation is rare and dangerous. Other climbers remained missing higher on the mountain. Rob Hall of Adventure Consultants was stranded near the south summit. Scott Fisher of Mountain Madness had collapsed during descent and was later found unresponsive. Doug Hansen, also with Adventure Consultants, did not return. Multiple teams were affected. Rescue efforts continued in limited form throughout May 11 and May 12, focused primarily on assisting those still capable of movement. Survivors began descending to Camp 3 and Camp 2 as weather stabilized. The descent itself required attention. Fixed ropes had to be navigated carefully. Injured climbers required support on steep sections of the Lot's face. At Camp 2, medical attention was provided as resources allowed. Frostbite injuries were assessed. Some climbers would later require amputations. Others suffered long-term neurological effects related to hypoxia. The events of May 10-11 had exceeded the logistical capacity of the expeditions involved. In the days that followed, information was relayed down the mountain, and eventually to Kathmandu and international media. The scale of the tragedy became widely known. 8 climbers died during the storm on May 10-11, making it one of the deadliest single days in Everest's history at that time. The decisions made during the storm were later examined in books, articles, and formal reviews. Questions were raised regarding turnaround times, fixed rope placement, crowding on summit day, and weather forecasting. Commercial guiding on Everest came under scrutiny. However, at the South Col on May 11, the focus was immediate and practical. Climbers needed to descend. Supplies were limited. The mountain remained indifferent to analysis. For Yasuko Namba, the objective that had guided years of preparation had been completed. She had reached the summit of Everest on the 10th of May 1996. She became the second Japanese woman to do so, and at that time, the oldest woman to summit Everest. The record stands within mountaineering history. Her life ended less than a day later, near the final camp below the summit. By the 12th of May 1996, most surviving climbers had descended below the South Kernel movement down. The Lot's face was deliberate and slow. Injuries limited speed. Sherpas and guides provided assistance where possible, stabilizing ropes and supporting weakened climbers. At base camp, news of the deaths was confirmed through radio reports. Families were notified through expedition coordinators and embassies. The names of the deceased were released in the following days: Yasuko Namba, Rob Hall, Scott Fisher, Doug Hansen, Andy Harris, and others from separate teams affected by the storm. Recovery of bodies above 8,000 meters was not feasible in most cases. Extreme altitude, technical terrain, and risk to rescuers prevented removal. Many who die in the death zone remain where they fall. Everest contains numerous such sites, marked quietly by clothing and equipment partially embedded in snow. Investigations into the events of May 10-11 were informal but extensive. Survivors published detailed accounts. Expedition practices were reviewed. Greater emphasis was later placed on fixed turnaround times and improved weather communication. The mountain itself did not change. In subsequent seasons, climbers returned. Commercial expeditions continued, though with heightened awareness of the risks demonstrated in 1996. The storm passed. The snow settled again across the South Kernel. The events of May 10-11, 1996, remain among the most examined disasters in high-altitude mountaineering. Books, documentaries, and expedition reports have reconstructed the sequence of delays, weather changes, and decisions that shaped the outcome. The storm did not introduce new dangers to Everest. It revealed how narrow the margin for survival has always been above 8,000 meters. Yasuko Namba's name appears in mountaineering records as a climber who completed the 7 summits on the 10th of May 1996. Her ascent is documented in summit logs and expedition archives. Her death is recorded alongside others who were caught in the same storm. Mount Everest continues to draw climbers from around the world. Weather windows still open and close within hours. Fixed ropes are still installed each season. Oxygen cylinders are still carried upward through the Khumbu icefall. The South Col remains exposed to wind. Snow falls. Tracks disappear. The record remains.